That's great to see, and it's fantastic to see you all here this morning and to hear a little bit more about your challenges. I really hope by the end we've begun to give you some solutions to those, because everything that you're talking about is really, really familiar. A client said to me yesterday, sorry to put you in the middle of our complexity. And I said, that's where we live. We are always in the middle of complexity. And that's our job. And that's what we really love, is helping organizations with amazing jobs in the world, which clearly all of you do, to navigate a clear course through all of that complexity that you described. So we're going to give you a bit of a flavour of how we work, not just what we do, but also how we do it. So there's going to be quite a lot of interaction. It's not going to be scary or technical. Strategy is often made out as a kind of very complex technical task, but actually we've boiled it down to some very powerful but quite simple questions, which will help you through. And hopefully by the end of it, you'll not only have some tools and tips and have heard from each other about the challenges, but you'll also actually have taken your very first step in further refining your strategy. So who are we? And I'm going to pass to Lakshmi in a sec. So Lucent, let me just talk about Lucent Consultancy first, and then I'll talk about myself. So Lucent is principally a strategy consultancy. But in order to deliver strategy, so we do pure strategy work, organisations commission us to come and do a strategy review. Quite often they're in a 3 or 5 year cycle, and we're brought in to do that. But in order also to create focus and impact in organisations, we work to support networks and partnerships, collaborations, and we also support organisations with their research, including, so I have an informal aid here, sorry about that, in their research, including data insights, and we have a data analyst who does data work and visualisation for us. And the other thing we do is support organisations as they change their culture and learn, so how they adapt, how they resolve some of the tensions that might be within the organisations that you've referred to. So we do all of those things, and we work with non-profit organisations and with foundations. So we've got kind of experience of both of those elements. All of the Lucent team are experienced executives and board members themselves. And my background is in, well, originally in women's rights. So originally I was an academic, and then I worked with the UK government for a period of time and ran a women's rights organisation, a small one. And then I ran a very large health organisation across the UK. So I've got experience of running small and rapidly growing organisations, and also very large organisations. And one of the things that I would reflect is that the strategy challenges are kind of the same. So I'm going to talk a bit more about my strategy experience and where I went wrong and what I learned in a minute, but I'll first of all hand to Lakshmi.
Hi, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to meet all of you, and I look forward to learning more about your work and your challenges and ways in which you could start to see through those challenges in the coming sort of hour and 15 minutes. So I'm Lakshmi Sundaram. I'm now based in London in the UK, but I'm from Switzerland, from Geneva, where Anna and Daniel are based. My family's from India, and my background is that I've worked in global health for many years in a range of different functions, from work supporting AIDS programs with the Ministry of Health in Rwanda, all the way to running the global health portfolio at the World Economic Forum. So sort of very hands-on technical to very big picture, large-scale advocacy work. And then in the last 10 years, I built an organization called Girls Not Brides, which is focused on ending child marriages around the world. It was a big global, started off with 3 people, and it grew very rapidly to become a global civil society partnership, bringing together about 1,000 plus organizations around the world, ranging from tiny community-based groups to big international NGOs, all coming together to focus on ending child marriage. And then more recently, I've been the interim executive director of Open Democracy, which is a nonprofit media platform, again, working on a whole range of different issues, but really holding power to account and giving voice to people who are traditionally excluded from the media. And I've been working with Catherine at Lucent for almost 2 years. And in that work, working with a range of organizations, again, from really tiny ones to enormous beasts, and trying to help them all find some clarity in the noise, as it were. And I might take a couple of minutes now just to say a few words about why it's been exciting for me to do this strategy consulting work, because I think, as many of you have said, and Daniel, when you were talking, I was sort of smiling and nodding, because for me initially, the whole idea of strategy and setting strategy for a tiny organization that was like, it had this enormous mandate, so the issue of child marriage is something that is now kind of talked about in global circles if you work in gender equality. When we started, no one was talking about it except for organizations that were really working on it at a local level. And so we had this mandate of like, bring it to global attention, create this global partnership. And it was like, oh my goodness, where do we go? What do we do? How do you even start to build a strategy? And many of our clients work in the climate field and have that similar sort of overwhelm of what do you even look at when everything is uncertain, everything is unknown. And so you kind of just put your head down and you just run and hope for the best. And while you're doing that, and particularly while you're growing an organization as well, it feels like you're so busy doing the doing and jumping on the opportunities that taking that step back to say, okay, can we look at our strategy? Can we see whether it felt, I don't know, for me, like in retrospect, it felt almost like it was a luxury or a self-indulgence. You know, it was like, oh, we have to get this done, because this is such a pressing issue, that stopping and taking stock and checking on, are we going in the right direction? Should we change track? Was really tricky. And the other thing for me that was really difficult was because we were in the mode of like jumping on opportunities as they came up. I think subconsciously I felt that if I define a strategy with too many boundaries, it's going to force me in one direction. And what if something else comes up around the corner? I mean, just to give an example, we had done some work on like planning for the year in, say, January, like the first weeks of January. The day after we finished our planning, the UK government announced that the Prime Minister was going to host this enormous event on the issue. So suddenly it was like, okay, we need to completely change track. But there's this feeling almost like if we define strategy too explicitly, we won't be able to jump on these opportunities. And what it meant is that what we were doing was I would take on the opportunity, but I wouldn't have anything to help me say what to let go of. So it just meant that we were adding things to do without being able to say, okay, if we're going to do this new opportunity well, what do we need to stop doing? And particularly, and I'm going to make an assumption, but all of the work that you're doing, and I'm assuming all of you and your colleagues are all the kind of very passionate, very driven people who want to do, want to change the world, want to make a difference. And so actually having a framework to help you say like, okay, we'll take this on, but we're going to stop something else is really, really difficult. And having that scaffolding would have been very helpful, and I think would have would have reduced the overwhelm for a number of us. But I'll stop. We'll share more as we go along. But I'll stop there. And Daniel, you wanted to say something, and then I'll pass on to Catherine.
Yes, exactly. Some of the grantees we work with often want to have this freedom. It's very important for them to be opportunistic, and they don't really know where they're going. And then on the other side, you have people within the organization who need a plan, who need to know where they're going. So it's kind of resolving this tension of we don't really know where you're going, so we want to explore. At the same time, we need a plan. And it's often very, and you may have people who are directors, executive directors. Often, it's my case as well. They're very intuitive people, and to tie them down to what seems like a document, a 5-year plan, something like that, it just goes away against their inclination, to keep a margin of maneuver to explore. And that's why they want to do it. They're creative people. So that's been my problem. And I've heard this from other directors we've talked with throughout the last couple of years. So this just really resonates with me. And thank you very much.
Daniel, it's interesting that you say that, because I'm not proud to say that the first time I wrote down a strategy, I think I tried to make it as broad as possible so that it would allow me to do the whole universe of things that I might want to do. So it was actually totally useless for the purpose of strategy, but that's what it felt like. I needed something that would give me the biggest possible umbrella, but not actually helpful for what a strategy is for. Catherine.
Thank you, brilliant. So I'm going to talk about so that's one classic strategy error, if you like, that we're very committed to help you avoid, which is the other way we talk about it is spray and pray, which is, do a bit of everything in the hopes that something will stick. A very classic error, but as Lakshmi describes and clearly resonating with you, actually ends in only one place, which is burnout and overwhelm. The other classic error is a focus on strategy as a very perfect document. So this is where I have to confess my strategy failures of the past. As a very young new chief executive, I thought it was my job to go away and write a very beautiful document that somehow compelled everybody around the same goal, and actually probably on the opposite end of the spectrum had some very clearly stated achievable goals, and it was going to transform the organization through the power of one single document. So I did exactly that. I went away and wrote a document, which I was rather pleased with. I thought was rather beautiful. Had a very carefully crafted vision and mission. And guess what? It made absolutely no impact whatsoever. The organisation carried on doing what it had done before. And I realised at that point that strategy is not a document. It's a process and a conversation and a process of engagement. And that is what helps people navigate that tension between planning and creativity, is people fully owning and understanding the strategy so that it informs their daily choices. So one of the things that we're very clear about at Lucent is that whilst there is a document at the end of the process, and in a sense it's your receipt, your acknowledgement that you've been through the process, what's really, really critical is that you have the right conversations with the right people at the right time, and that is really strategy. We're going to talk about that process in a minute, and I think that the shift for me in terms of moving away from the conception of strategy as a document to thinking about a process was really a shift about opening up that strategy to a much broader audience, but also making it a much more creative process. one where actually, and that's something we observe with our clients, you end up quite often in a place that you hadn't anticipated at the beginning, because you've opened up to that much broader range of inputs. You end up often in a more exciting and creative place, because you've got the feedback from the front line, as well as the big ideas and the big vision that changes, that helps you center your work. So we're going to talk about how that series of conversations can operate in a minute. But before we do that, and I think we'll do it in a whole room, we've heard a little bit about your strategy challenges. What would be really helpful would be to hear something about what you think will look and feel different once you've undertaken a good strategy process. So what's the real aim and the outcome that you would be looking for in a strategy process? So I'm going to leave you to mull that over for a second, and then obviously over to you to start making your contributions the traditional way, with raised hands or in chat. So what looks and feels different at the end of a strategy process?
Let's just, if before we move to the ship, one thing maybe just to add to that for a young organization is that the strategy doesn't have to be, you know, a 10-year thing. Your short-term strategy can be, we are testing out a range of approaches to find the where it is that we can have the greatest impact. That is a strategy, but it's sort of everyone agreeing on what it is that you're doing and why it is that you're doing it is the bit that's the important bit. That doesn't mean that you need to have, like, the strategy can be to find answers to a set of questions that you know in 3 years will lead you to hone in on one of your choices, for instance. So there's also just that kind of thing that sometimes for a young organization, that may be more of the focus initially, but it's then honing down. Maybe it's not 25 questions that you're trying to answer, but 3.
Okay, so I'm just going to quickly introduce our framework that we work with clients to help them really unlock their strategy. And then Lakshmi is going to talk through a couple of examples of how this has happened in practice. So I'm just going to share my screen, and we'll send all of this to you after the fact, along with some questions that you can use to help you, you know, if you're wanting to start this process, to help you already within your organization. So this is our strategy ship framework. It looks very simple. There was a lot of mess and pain to get to this process, by the way, just in case you were wondering. But we really challenged ourselves to boil down the big, powerful questions that help organizations define a strategy. And some of these questions will be quite familiar from other strategy approaches, but we've got a couple that are quite different, and I'm going to talk through all of them. So let me start, first of all, with the question that's probably most familiar, which is the why question. And we talk about this being your North Star. So this is about the change that you as an organization want to see in the world, the reason that you have been set up. It's often referred to as a vision document. And having a really powerful why is particularly helpful through periods of change, when you've got change in personnel within your organization, or when your context changes very rapidly. Going back to your North Star and figuring out your purpose in the world is a really critical part of a strategy process. I'm going to make one observation which you might find a bit surprising, but you'll figure out why in a second, which is that actually our experience of the not-for-profit world is that their whys are relatively well defined, and quite often when we walk into an organization, they already have a very good articulation of their why, but it's not enough. And what they've tried to do is move from the why to the operationalization, the how, and move between these two questions. And there is a world of possibilities. So to your point, points that were made earlier about competing priorities, especially when you're dealing with very major issues like human rights or climate change, or indeed ending child marriage, there are so many ways that you could operate that your why and your how just do not answer your questions. It gives you multiple areas of possibility. And so quite often we're asked to come into organisations where they've gone through a cycle of why and how and become totally exhausted because it hasn't narrowed down their possibilities. In fact, what it's done, if anything, having those strategy conversations, is opened up more possibilities and not enabled them to make the choices that they need to. So this is where our other three questions, which are less common questions asked in strategy, but very, very powerful questions, come in and help you answer that. And that's why we work through all five together. So the first of these additional, what's often worked on, but we've got a couple of questions that sit below the waterline, are less visible, but absolutely essential in terms of setting your strategy. And the first of those is, why us? What is it that gives you a particular position or advantage in the world in which you work? How are you situated among a whole group of change makers? What is it that you contribute to the change that you're wanting to see? And this is what helps, in reference to a conversation before about, we've got a great big vision for the change we want to see in the world, but where we're less clear is about our contribution. Focusing on the why us question is critical in that. And we do two things to support people to understand why us. One is we look at their assets, and we think of those very broadly to think about not only time and money, but also people's relationships, their skills and expertise, and their infrastructure, and what specific and particular assets that they bring to their work. And the clue to the why us question is often in their assets. And the other piece that we do, which is very powerful here, is we map a field and map the landscape of change makers that the organisation is working in, because none of you are alone. You are all working alongside governments or other NGOs or international agencies, and understanding what you can do that others cannot in that field is a really critical part of narrowing down this otherwise enormous range of possible actions. So the why us question, incredibly powerful. The second, the other question that sits below the waterline, but again, incredibly powerful in terms of defining strategy. And this is where, in reference to earlier questions, actually, we often get some areas of quite significant disagreement, is to have a conversation about actually your view about the difference that you're wanting to achieve as an organisation. So what specifically you have agency to change in the world, and how you think that will happen. So quite often people talk about a theory of change in this instance, and that is about naming the difference and how you will make that happen. And again, what that does is it helps take out from that huge ambition, it enables you to talk about the very specific change that you are trying to achieve and how you as an agency will make that happen. So those two questions that sit below the waterline here are very, very powerful questions for a strategy. The other one that we're working on increasingly is about who. So it's quite an interesting phenomenon, especially for campaigning organisations, to have a conversation about who is going to benefit from your work, and can you be really clear and specific about who will benefit. And we've been working particularly recently on making sure that there's a more diverse audience in terms of organisations' engagement in the WHO. So a realism really about how you're seeing the benefits of your work and who is experiencing those benefits. It's a very powerful question in terms of turning the telescope round, if you like, looking at it from the point of beneficiaries and making sure that you're reaching that broader range of beneficiaries and you're not working to the benefit of only a very exclusive few individuals. So having worked through the why us, the what, the who, the final question really relates to your operational plan. And ensuring that you've got everything that you need, testing out what you need to do in order to work effectively and make swift progress. And again, one of the things that I would say, to build on Lakshmi's point earlier, is that especially for new organisations, your how should have a lot of room for experimentation, adaptation, and change within it. You do not have to fix if the rest of these questions have been answered, you do not have to fix your how. You can keep that quite open and experimental as you learn as an organisation about what works, and that is entirely legitimate. So we often work with the big goals, well-defined goals, but with a lot of flexibility in terms of the actual operationalisation of those goals. So I hope that begins to give you a flavour of those 5 questions and how they work to help you define your strategy. But there's nothing like an actual case study to help you understand how we put this into practice. And I'm going to turn to Lakshmi to give a couple of illustrations.
Thanks, Catherine. So just to give a flavour of what this looks like in practice, I'll just talk very quickly about 2 organizations that we've worked with. The first one, where really the focus, the main focus for them, where they had quite a lot of sticking points, was the why us question. So this is an organization that was focused, it's a grant making organization, but also that needed to fundraise for its work. And its focus was really on giving grants to really small community-based organizations, groups, minority-led organizations around the UK in this instance, focused on gender rights and in particular women's rights. And when we came in to have this strategy discussion with them, there was a real crisis of confidence within the organization. Most of the people in the team were almost apologetic that they existed. They almost felt like, oh, are we a barrier between money and these community-based groups? Oh, what are we competing with the community-based groups? Why are we here, basically? And when we were able to do some work with them on the assets and their place in the field, this picture started really emerging that they had incredible value, that the community-based organizations that they were giving these grants to saw them as a real ally, and that they brought a whole range of skills and expertise and networks to these community-based organizations. And it just made it helped them really hone in on what it was that was in their organizational DNA that could create the greatest difference. And what that's meant is that they've now started really investing much more in those bits of their organization, their networks, their relationships, the way they support these other groups. And that's really changed the way that they not only think of themselves, but some of the choices that they've been making about where they should be expanding in the future. With another organization, also it so happens focused on, this one's focused on human rights in childbirth. This is a very small organization, very small team. but that had recently gotten a really big profile because of some of the work that they were doing over COVID. And for this group, there were three sort of very big buckets of activities that they were working on that were a bit interconnected, but they were essentially being pulled in three different directions. The team was completely stressed out, burnt out, because they just didn't know how they could expand, and they felt they had this enormous mandate. What was really important here was to focus in on the discussion about the what was the change they wanted to achieve, and what was it going to take to make that happen. And here, as we talked about before, some of those disagreements came out because there were multiple legitimate avenues to creating change. And what was really important was to surface those and come to a decision across the board and senior leadership on where was it that this group of recognizing that they could not do everything. What was the mix of focus that would help them achieve their aims, and what was the scaffolding that they needed to do that. And in some ways, this organization represents some of the tensions that we see in so many different groups, because unfortunately, however beautiful your strategy process, there's usually not one clear direction that you should take. It's all a series of like multiple good options, and picking one direction, and learning and coming back and checking that's the way to go, because most of the organizations that you work in, that we've worked with, they are full of smart, motivated people who, if there was a clear single shining answer, they would be able to jump on that quickly. So it is about oftentimes just naming the trade-offs that will need to be made, having an honest discussion about what is or is not feasible, where it is that we might want to flex and experiment, and then picking one of those options, but doing it in a way that people feel that they've been heard, that it is an evidence-based decision, and that it is in the best interest of the people that ultimately need to benefit from your work. Catherine, back to you.
So I've stopped sharing the screen, and it's really the next breakout conversation about which of those questions you think really resonated with you and could be really powerful within your organisation, and why. And also to think about what your next steps might be. So, and obviously we're also open to questions. If there were any questions sparked when you saw that framework, about the specifics behind the questions and the techniques and tools you might use. But yeah, we'd love to know which of those questions really resonated, and why, of course.
Just to answer Daniel's question, the question was which of these 5 questions resonated with us and why? Yeah. Maybe I can start just sharing my thoughts. Perhaps the latest case study which Lakshmi shared, because the question about the what, and it's not only because of our own experience, but also because of the experience which we had communicating with different nonprofit organizations, because quite often we hear and experience ourselves that the organization is indeed overwhelmed with everything they are doing, and it's a question of like chicken and egg. They don't have resources, but to get the resources they need to work even more, but they're already working too much. So that's like the quite common challenge according to our experience, and also according to the kind of experience which have been shared with us. But when I talk about resources, it's not necessarily like fundraising in this sense. It's also human resources, because teams can be really very small and overstretched, where people like do everything. Sometimes I look at some nonprofits websites and I think that there might be, I don't know, 50 people behind. But then I start meeting with the teams that actually there are 5 or even sometimes 3. And I start asking myself how it can be done by 3 or 5 people. And they actually quite clear very often with their challenges. They understand that they need to hire people. They understand that they need to do, I don't know, fundraising communication. So they're quite clear where they want to go and with their mission as well, and what has to be done and how to do the actual work. But this overwhelm part and what we start with, that's actually, I think is a really big thing. Well, kind of from the experience we had. Yeah, so just to share that this is the question which resonated the most, perhaps.
And that's really interesting, because I think in that why us bit, when we talk about assets, part of that discussion is very much about really trying to root what it is that you want to do in the reality of your situation. So whether that's, what your budget currently is, but also what are the opportunities in the field more broadly. So for one of the organizations we worked with is a very large organization in the UK that had huge ambitions, but actually when you started digging into the finances, they were, there were some really fundamental problems that they needed to address first before they could do any kind of investment in sort of building new things. So with them, it was a question of, right, what can you do to consolidate what you've got now, and make sure that you put yourself on a strong footing. So again, it's about sort of not necessarily this beautiful theoretical framework of what are all the wonderful things that you could do in the future, but really given what you actually have in hand and what is realistically possible for you to access, where should you be going? And I think, and that's part of that, again, a combination of the why us and the what, where you can really start to get to some of those answers.
Yeah, thank you, Lakshmi. Yeah, Daniel, please. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's not one specific question, but what is really useful is to see the how, that it's actually a flexible question. And that could bring us this sort of experimentational aspect. So it's really, really great and changed the way I view strategy so far. And it's very, very useful. And to see that the why, us, and the what are kind of below the surface and they don't change so much. And that's also very useful. It gives the whole thing a different shape around strategy. It's really, really great. We are working recently with a coach, a colleague from Nonprofit Builder, Jo Richings, and she asked the questions in a different way, which allows us to answer. For example, she said, "Why do your beneficiaries like you?" or something like that. Do you remember, Anna, what the questions Jo had, which allowed us to quite easily answer these questions? Actually, that was also very helpful.
Exactly. Or what pain points we're solving, or what is it there for them, for the main stakeholders? Exactly, and we're focused on that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's the other way of absolutely, and that's where we like to really make sure that there's some good opportunities to talk to some of the stakeholders to understand from their perspective, because I think also, when you're an organization and you're doing that running, you have some assumptions about what it is that people appreciate or don't appreciate about you and your work, and actually getting that information directly from the people who you are supposed to be serving, I think really puts a spotlight and can give a different flavor to that discussion. The other thing is in terms of, and this I think is an important thing in fields where things are constantly moving is actually doing a quick mapping of the field, to understand who else is out there and kind of what they're doing. And that's important. It doesn't have to be a big, complicated process. We often do this in a 45-minute discussion with the team and Miro boards and a structured conversation, because a lot of this is in people's heads, but really trying to understand, like, what is it that your field looks like? Who are the, in nonprofits, we don't talk about competitors, but who are the other organizations that are doing similar or overlapping work as you, and where might there be potential synergies or partnerships or those kinds of opportunities. One of the groups that we worked with, that process was really interesting for them, because when they started their 60-year-old organization, when they started, they were the only ones in their field working on an issue. When we did this exercise with them, suddenly there were like hundreds of small advocacy organizations, and actually maybe their role, their value added, their assets were in a different place than what their kind of origin story told about them. So just, again, trying to frame it within reality and context, and changing context is important. And just to build on Daniel's point about there's flexibility in the how, I think it's the boundaried flexibility that is important. So it's kind of, there's absolutely the changing, the learning, the adaptation, the experimentation, but having the discipline to come back every, whatever it is, a couple of months, 6 months, depends on the organization, but checking in to say, okay, what is it that we've learned from these different approaches that we're testing? What is it that we should be changing? What is it that we should be dropping? If you don't have that kind of discipline and the circularity, that flexibility can become a crutch to say, right, we're going to go back to the good old days where we could do anything and everything, and we're not bounded by a strategy. So just wanted to add that little note of caution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really. Can I add something? Sorry, it's really interesting that what you say, because for me this question, why us, is really important. This is which resonated with me the most, and it was really nice to see that looking for this question, I can easily answer which person from my crew will, which question will resonate with a person in my crew. And this is nice because it's mean that I know them better than I thought. And but this question, why us? For me, it's important because I know that what we do, that a lot of organizations do, and that what I said on the beginning, that our goal it wasn't to be in long-term organization, but only for a moment. That answering for this question can show the long-term goals for us when we see the strengths and weakness of our organization with this question. And this question, they are so big that you can have a lot of small questions above them. It would be nice to have them like some examples of the questions that can be behind of this big one. It would be so helpful. I know that it's not so easy to have them, but if you have something like that, like something, it would be really helpful. This is like my little, yeah.
So Barbara, I just pick up a couple of things. So great that you love the why us question. Good choice. One thing just to add, so I think it really resonates with your experience, is the other thing about why us and awareness of the field is it encourages organisations to think about what they can do in partnership. And where others have assets that they need. So just to take an example of the rights organisation that Lakshmi was talking about earlier, one of the things they wanted to do was to have individuals know their rights and be able to be international advocates of their rights. But their actual access to those individuals was tiny. Whereas there was an organisation right next door to them who have thousands of members and a live conversation with lots of people who need that information. Self-evident that they didn't need to try and build, I mean, you're building an access to markets is one of the most difficult assets to build. It would have taken them decades to get those thousands of people registered and in conversation with them. And made no sense. What made sense was to work in active partnership. So they had the expertise, the other organisation had the access to market. You know, there you go, you make beautiful music together and actually add benefits to each other's pieces of work. One of the things I'd say, so we will share with you our kind of pamphlet, which has some of the exercises you can work through in order to get there and to define your strategy. I would be a little bit cautious about adding even more questions. These are pretty big questions in themselves. And one of the things to say is it's good to work through all of them, but to do it little and often. Strategy is very hard mental work. And again, I suppose I should have mentioned the other mistake that I made at the beginning and lots of organisations make is to say, oh, we'll do it in a week, or we'll have a 2-day session and it will be resolved. But actually you have to do it bite size by bite size and have some time for reflection. So little and often with some time for reflection. So what's really important is that you work your way through all of these questions and you come back and refine. So again, one of the things that happens with the why is people will spend a lot of time refining, but we quite often say, no, that's good enough for now. Let's answer these other questions and then come back, and the refinement kind of writes itself. I think that, you know, once one has been through a full cycle of all of these questions, you get a much more powerful kind of one-pager or fuller strategy at the end. Am I okay to stop sharing the screen for a minute? I actually can't see everybody's lovely faces, so it'd be lovely to.
Yeah. One thing I just wanted to add on that why us question. I think it's also a really useful way for. So, how am I going to put this? There's a number of organizations, and I'm sure you've seen them in the fields that you work in, where it's a very charismatic person who comes in and says, I really want to do X, Y, Z, and I'm going to go and help those people somewhere. That why us question really helps to focus in on what is it that you know, and often these people are very full of themselves and they want to put themselves out there. The why us question is a really good way of focusing in on what is it that you bring that other people do not bring. And it's what we try really hard to do with the organizations we work with is highlight who are the people who are doing the frontline work that that you could connect with and elevate, and as Catherine said, build those partnerships with. And I think that's a really critical thing to highlight is not just about understanding what your assets are, but understanding where it is that other people who, for a variety of reasons, may not have the access to donors or limelight or any of those things that you may have. Who are those other people, those other groups that actually have a much deeper knowledge of the people, the people that you're ultimately trying to benefit. And I think that's also a really important thing to, you know, Barbara, it was really interesting to hear you say that this is not something that you've been hoping to do long term. And I think so few organizations come in with that attitude. There's a bit of like, well, we're here, we're doing such, you know, we're such good people for doing this work. And it's really refreshing to hear the side of like, this is not actually what we were planning. Someone else should be doing it, but now we're in this situation. So just that realism bit of it. And I think the point about having like loads of sub questions, I think part of what we're trying to do, so as Catherine said, we do have a framework with some exercises, and but a lot of this is about trying to take away the overwhelm. And so trying to take away the hundreds of questions, and what we didn't want is to have a really thick, this is how you do strategy booklets, but more a kind of start having that conversation, see what starts coming up, and then hone in to what's coming up, because that's probably where some of your tensions are. That's probably where some of your unresolved conversations are, and where it is that you need to focus to get through.
Yeah. If I can ask maybe one question, when we talk to organizations, quite often, well, small overstretched organizations, quite often they're very clear with what they want to focus on, and quite often these are the fundraising, building a team, growing a team, and also making the processes and the systems more efficient. And at the same time, I mean, to do fundraising, someone has to do fundraising. It can bring results maybe in a year or two, so that they can actually hire people, and they're already overstretched. And somehow they quite often not even highlight that they need help with strategy. So they perhaps feel pretty confident in their mission, and they know where you're going, where they're going, and how they want to get there, and they're trying to do it. I mean, despite all this being overstretched, would you say that maybe our recommendations should be for them to actually start with a strategy before they're looking at fundraising, hiring, or making processes and systems more efficient, even if it's not something they're asking for? Could we say like that? No. What would be your thinking in that? Yeah.
A couple of reflections. I'm sure Lakshmi will add to. I think if there are two things that are really helpful in terms of those development. One is to. Oh, I'm just wondering whether I've frozen. Oh, sorry. There we go. Sorry. So in terms of guiding you through that, being really clear about purpose and the why of that absolutely will shape your fundraising and your work with the team. So I do think that that's really important. And the other element of this in terms of organizational development, is not just thinking about the kind of short-term fixes, but what assets you're building in that process. So one of the things that I think is incredibly powerful about the not-for-profit sector is its insights and insights from people who have direct lived experience or expertise in an area, and its relationships. So as you're building and developing an organization, thinking not only about the specific policies and procedures, but how you're building your relationships, your expertise or insights, your infrastructure in a way that bolsters your why us question. So I think both of those things framed within the why and why us will become much more powerful.
To add, I mean, I think the really important thing one really important thing to recognize is that all of the organizations that you're working with, and all the organizations that we work with, they all operate in the real world. And so sometimes it's just like, you know what, we don't have any money, we need to get fundraise, we're going to work with what we've got to get the fundraising done. And but I think that the idea of having strategy conversations as short bits is that it's not necessarily that you have to do, let's put everything else on pause, do a 6-month strategy process, and then start doing these other things. All of this, it's messy. All of these things have to happen in real life in parallel. You know, we've worked with some clients where they've had to make some really big strategic discussions before they've been able to have the conversation about their strategy. Is that the ideal way to do things? No, but is that the reality of their situation? Absolutely. And so it's more about, okay, what information do you have right now that can help guide that strategic discussion, that decision that you have to take, you know, next week? And it is what it is, and let's build the bigger picture as we go along. It's we work with a number of climate organizations in the UK, and in the run-up to the COP last year, that was a big externally imposed deadline for some of them to do certain pieces of work. You couldn't sit around and do navel gazing at that stage. You just had to work with what you've got at the time, make sure that you're continue to carve out that space to do that strategy work, but also recognize that there's some, but then also for, you know, for some of them, it was sort of, okay, are we chasing this COP moment because everyone else is chasing this COP moment, but actually what we're doing has nothing to do with COP, and so it doesn't actually matter, we're just getting caught up in the cycle, which was the case for some organizations, whereas for others it was like, no, actually the work that we're doing is directly related to COP, and so we have to make sure that we're around that, and so let's find another way to carve out that strategy space, but continue to take whatever we're learning through that process into the work that we're doing. There's just a reality aspect to it that, you know, and I think for me, just going back to the personal experience stuff early on, I think I was so worried about like, oh, I need to do this in the right way to get the right strategy, that it felt like until I can do it in that way, I should just keep going. Whereas the reality really should have been, this is important, I need to carve out time to do it, but it may not look like a textbook how it's supposed to.
And there's an element of practice makes perfect in all of this. So, you know, just a final thought, which is, you know, so that COP example, very useful one. And what was really heartening is that because one of our organizations went in aware of these strategy questions, for example, they didn't just do all of the busyness of the day, they started collecting and properly working with their relationships and all of their partnerships. So they were building at the same time an asset about a new set of external stakeholders. So, you know, it is exactly as Lakshmi says, you have to work within the reality of it, but having started the process, we very quickly see shifts in thinking, which mean people are starting to make some seemingly small changes in their operations, but actually that begins to deliver them some benefits, which is saying, you know, we need to build better external relationships. Let's start now. You know, if that's on a scrappy Excel spreadsheet for the moment and we come back to it, then that's fine. But it's the mindfulness about that need to have a sense of purpose and have a sense of that, you know, that longer term build and finding your position in the market.
Sense of purpose, yeah, indeed. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Lakshmi, Catherine. Any more kind of final questions, or I think there is some reflection, I guess, needed before questions emerge. In any case, many thanks to Lakshmi and Catherine. That was really great and super useful, really lots of food for thought. I guess there will be a discussion with Daniel as well and with Natalia about our further strategy. And just to add that feel free, please, to contact Lakshmi, Catherine, with your questions for one-to-one or for further strategy process. And I will follow up later, perhaps today, tomorrow, with the handouts or whatever has to be shared with the participants and those who registered but couldn't make it for today's session. And on this note, thank you as well to the participants for your, yeah, exactly, that's the website which Catherine is sharing, which we'll reshare again in the further communications. Thank you everybody for the very insightful discussions as well, and for your contribution and your sharing your experiences as well. And thanks a lot to Catherine and Lakshmi, and let's hope we'll be collaborating in the future. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was great,
Thanks.
great session.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Lovely to meet you all. Thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.